This video examines a fictional confrontation built around a familiar cultural idea. What happens when someone challenges a figure whose reputation is already larger than life? Rather than treating this as a simple fight narrative, the focus here is on perception, decision-making, and the psychological weight of challenging a long-established legend. The scenario of Jason challenging Chuck Norris is interesting not because of who might win in a physical sense, but because of what the challenge represents. One side symbolizes ambition, urgency, and the desire to prove oneself. The other side represents legacy, authority, and a reputation built over decades of cultural storytelling and myth-making. When someone steps up to a legendary figure, the conflict often begins long before any real action takes place. The expectations of the audience, the media framing, and the historical image of the legend create a mental battleground that can shape the outcome before the first move is even made. In many cases, the challenger is already seen as the underdog, not necessarily because of skill, but because of narrative positioning. This creates an uneven psychological environment. The challenger carries pressure to impress, to shock, or to rewrite expectations. Meanwhile, the legend benefits from familiarity, assumed superiority, and the comfort of being seen as the standard rather than the experiment. That difference in mental footing can influence confidence, pacing, and even public interpretation of the same actions. The phrase "big mistake" in the title does not automatically imply incompetence. Instead, it suggests a deeper idea, that some challenges carry hidden risks beyond the obvious. It raises the question of whether courage alone is enough, or whether understanding the symbolic power of an opponent matters just as much as physical readiness. This is not a story about mocking ambition or glorifying dominance. It is about examining why certain confrontations feel one-sided before they even begin, and how reputation, expectation, and timing can transform a bold move into a strategic error. The goal is to understand the layers beneath the surface, not to hype the outcome, but to analyze why it feels inevitable to many viewers. When someone challenges a legend, are they fighting the person or the reputation built around them? I want to approach this topic in a thoughtful and grounded way, because it's easy to fall into hype, exaggeration, or fan-driven storytelling when talking about a name like Chuck Norris. Instead of treating this as a fantasy battle or a power-scaling debate, this analysis treats the situation as a symbolic and psychological case study. This means we're not asking, who would win in a real fight? We're asking, why does this challenge feel like a mistake before it even happens? That difference matters. Some of what I'm going to say is based on cultural perception, media portrayal, and the myth built around legendary figures, not on literal reality. Chuck Norris here represents an idea more than just a person. Jason, on the other hand, represents a challenger, someone driven by ambition, hunger, pride, or the need to prove themselves. So when Jason challenges Chuck Norris, the story stops being about strength alone. It becomes about timing, expectations, pressure, narrative, and psychology. I'm also assuming that viewers already bring their own biases into this scenario. Many people already see Chuck Norris as unbeatable, not because of real-world evidence, but because of years of jokes, movies, stories, and cultural reinforcement. That perception shapes how any challenge against him is interpreted. That's important to admit up front, because if we ignore perception, we miss the real point of the story. Another thing to clarify, this isn't meant to insult Jason or paint him as foolish. Challenging a legend can come from many motivations: ambition, desperation, courage, or even strategic thinking. In some cases, aiming for the biggest name is the only way to get noticed at all. So instead of labeling the challenger as arrogant, the better question is whether the context of the challenge makes success realistically possible. I'm also aware that this type of topic can easily turn into hero worship or character glorification. That's not the goal here. The goal is to analyze why some figures become psychologically untouchable and why stepping into that space often puts the challenger at an immediate disadvantage, even before skill is considered. If this sounds analytical, that's intentional. This framing treats the confrontation like a thought experiment. What happens when confidence meets cultural myth? What happens when ambition meets a reputation that already feels unbeatable? What happens when the public already expects one side to win? Those expectations matter more than people often realize. In many competitive situations, whether in sports, entertainment, or real life, perception can influence outcomes as strongly as preparation. When the audience, the media, and even the challenger themselves already believe one side has the upper hand, that belief can affect decision-making, performance, and judgment in subtle but powerful ways. So throughout this video, I'm not presenting final answers. I'm walking through reasoning, showing how assumptions form, how narratives build pressure, and how certain choices begin to look risky once we consider the psychological and symbolic layers around them. You don't have to fully agree with this perspective. In fact, disagreement can make the discussion more interesting. The goal is not to declare who is right, but to explore why this challenge feels like a big mistake to many observers before anything even happens. Do you think overanalyzing a challenge makes it clearer, or does it sometimes distract from the simple reality of competition? To understand why this challenge feels significant, it helps to separate the people involved from what they represent. This isn't just a scenario about two individuals. It's about two very different positions in a symbolic hierarchy: the rising challenger and the established legend. Jason represents momentum. He stands for ambition, forward motion, and the urge to prove worth in a competitive space. His role in this story is defined by effort, risk, and the desire to change how he is perceived. He isn't protected by legacy. He is trying to build one. Chuck Norris, in contrast, represents permanence. His public image has been shaped over decades through film, pop culture, and exaggerated myth. Over time, he has become less of a person and more of a concept, a shorthand for dominance, control, and inevitability. Whether or not those traits are literally accurate is almost irrelevant. What matters is that the audience believes them. This creates an uneven psychological landscape. When someone like Jason issues a challenge, he is not just stepping into a contest. He is stepping into a narrative that already favors the legend. The audience expects a certain outcome. Media framing reinforces it. Even neutral observers often assume the challenger is entering at a disadvantage before the event begins. That context changes everything. In a neutral situation, a challenge might feel like a test of skill. But in this scenario, it becomes a test of status, credibility, and symbolic power. Jason is forced to fight on two levels at once: the physical or tactical level and the perception level. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris benefits from narrative gravity. He doesn't need to prove himself in the same way. His reputation does part of the work for him. Even small successes feel amplified, while mistakes are more likely to be forgiven or reframed. This is not about fairness, it's about environment. Another important layer is timing. A challenge can mean different things depending on when it happens. If a challenger faces a legend at the peak of their cultural relevance, the psychological pressure intensifies. The challenger isn't just trying to win. They're trying to disrupt a long-standing story. That disruption is difficult because stories resist change. People tend to protect narratives they are familiar with. If Chuck Norris represents an idea of invincibility, many viewers subconsciously root for that idea to remain intact. This means Jason isn't only competing against an opponent. He is competing against audience expectation. So when the title frames the challenge as a big mistake, it doesn't necessarily imply incompetence. It points to a structural imbalance. It suggests that the challenge itself may be strategically risky because of the cultural weight behind one side of the confrontation. The context then is not built on strength alone. It's built on history, storytelling, reputation, and perception. Understanding that environment helps explain why some challenges feel doomed. Not because the challenger lacks ability, but because the stage itself is tilted before the event even begins. This section sets the foundation for what follows. Not a hype-driven battle story, but an examination of how narrative power can shape outcomes before action even takes place. The challenge is already at a disadvantage before any real confrontation begins. At first glance, It might seem like Jason's challenge is a straightforward test of confidence versus experience. But when we look closer, the imbalance isn't only physical or tactical. It's psychological and narrative-based. When someone challenges a legendary figure like Chuck Norris, they're stepping into a situation where expectations are already predetermined. The audience often assumes the outcome in advance. This assumption creates pressure on the challenger while giving the legend an invisible advantage. Jason is entering as the one who must prove something. He carries the burden of justification. He has to show why he deserves the challenge, why he belongs in the same space, and why the outcome should be taken seriously. Every mistake he makes is magnified, and every success he achieves is often seen as not enough. Chuck Norris, by contrast, enters with a psychological shield. His reputation acts as a buffer. If he performs well, it reinforces the myth. If he performs average, people may still frame it as dominance because it aligns with what they already believe. This creates an uneven dynamic where the challenger must exceed expectations, while the legend only needs to meet them. There's also a pacing problem built into this situation. Challengers often feel pressure to rush, impress, or force results early to prove their legitimacy. Legends, however, can afford patience. They don't need to convince anyone. They only need to remain consistent with their image. That difference can influence decision-making in critical moments. Jason may feel compelled to take risks. Chuck Norris can afford to wait for mistakes. If this were presented visually, the contrast would be subtle but meaningful. Jason's body language might appear tense, reactive, or urgent. Chuck Norris would likely appear calm, controlled, and unbothered. Even small movements, pauses, or expressions could reinforce the idea that one side is under pressure while the other is in control. The visuals would support the script, but the real meaning comes from the underlying dynamic. Who is expected to chase the moment, and who is expected to own it? This doesn't mean Jason is incapable, unskilled, or destined to fail. Challengers sometimes defy expectations. Legends sometimes falter. Outcomes are never guaranteed. However, the key point is that the structure of the challenge itself puts Jason at a disadvantage. He isn't starting from neutral ground. He is starting from a position where public belief, narrative momentum, and psychological framing already lean against him. So the big mistake is not necessarily issuing the challenge. The potential mistake is underestimating how much of the battle happens before any actual confrontation, in the minds of the audience, in the framing of the story, and in the expectations placed on both sides. This sets the stage for the next layer. Not just why the challenge is difficult, but how certain choices made by the challenger can unintentionally deepen that disadvantage. Confidence without strategic awareness turns a bold challenge into a liability. Jason's decision to challenge Chuck Norris may appear courageous on the surface, but courage alone does not determine the quality of a decision. The problem arises when confidence is not matched with a realistic understanding of the opponent's nature, image, and influence. Reasoning. When a challenger faces an ordinary opponent, raw confidence can be an advantage. It can fuel energy, aggression, and belief. But when the opponent is a legendary figure, confidence needs to be paired with restraint, planning, and narrative awareness. Jason's mindset likely focuses on proving himself, landing a defining moment, making a statement, or forcing recognition. That urgency can lead to rushed decisions, emotional reactions, and predictable behavior. The desire to impress can quietly undermine discipline. Chuck Norris, by contrast, does not need to prove his worth. His image already carries authority. This allows him to approach the confrontation with patience rather than pressure. Where Jason feels the need to create moments, Chuck Norris can afford to wait for them. This creates a strategic imbalance. A challenger driven by confidence may overextend, take unnecessary risks, or commit to actions meant to look impressive rather than effective. Meanwhile, a legend benefits from letting the challenger reveal patterns, mistakes, and emotional triggers. The challenge becomes less about physical ability and more about psychological control. Jason's confidence, if unmanaged, can make him predictable. Chuck Norris's composure, if consistent, makes him difficult to read. That difference shapes momentum. Another factor is the role of audience perception. When a challenger displays excessive confidence, viewers may interpret it as arrogance. That interpretation can influence how every success or failure is judged. If Jason performs well, it may be seen as temporary. If he falters, it may be seen as confirmation of overconfidence. Chuck Norris, however, benefits from the opposite framing. Calm behavior appears authoritative. Minimal effort appears calculated. Even small advantages feel larger because they align with the existing narrative. So the mistake isn't confidence itself. It's failing to adjust confidence to the situation. A challenger facing a legend often needs to do the opposite of what instinct suggests. Instead of trying to dominate early, they may need to remain disciplined. Instead of trying to impress, they may need to remain unreadable. Instead of proving power, they may need to control pacing. If Jason approaches this challenge as a standard contest, he risks playing into a structure that already favors Chuck Norris. Visually, this could appear through contrast in movement and behavior. Jason might appear reactive, pressing forward, attempting to force exchanges. Chuck Norris might appear composed, minimal, and selective. The contrast would reinforce the sense that one side is expending energy to prove something, while the other is conserving energy to maintain control. Confidence is not a flaw. In many cases, it is what drives growth, risk-taking, and breakthrough moments. Jason's willingness to challenge a legend could reflect ambition rather than recklessness. However, in this specific context, confidence without strategic restraint increases vulnerability. The real danger is not believing in oneself. It's believing that belief alone is enough to overcome reputation, experience, and narrative positioning. This leads into the next layer of analysis: how misunderstandings about the type of opponent can turn ambition into a structural disadvantage. Now let's slow this down for a moment, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand what's actually happening in this kind of scenario. Most people reduce situations like this to simple thinking: strong versus strong, confidence versus experience, young versus old, challenger versus champion. But that framing is too shallow. This isn't just a confrontation between two individuals. It's a confrontation between two positions. And positions operate differently than people do. Jason is operating from a position of ascent. He's climbing. He's pushing forward. He's trying to change how he's seen. That means he's naturally operating in a state of pressure. Every action he takes is loaded with meaning. Every decision feels like it has consequences. Every moment carries emotional weight. Chuck Norris is operating from a position of stability. He's not trying to rise. He's trying to maintain. That creates a completely different psychological state. Maintenance requires control, not urgency. It requires patience, not force. It requires consistency, not spectacle. This difference matters more than most people realize. When someone is climbing, they feel time pressure. When someone is established, they control time. That alone changes behavior. Jason is likely thinking in terms of moments. I need to create something. I need to make this count. I need to prove something now. Chuck Norris is thinking in terms of structure. I don't need to rush. I don't need to force. I just need to remain who I already am. This is where the real imbalance forms. People often assume legends dominate because of superior skill alone. But in many cases, they dominate because of psychological positioning. They operate from calm, not urgency. They react, not chase. They respond, not force. That's not magic. That's environment. Another misunderstanding is thinking that the challenger is foolish for trying. That's not fair either. Growth doesn't happen without risk. Recognition doesn't happen without bold moves. Jason's challenge makes sense from a human perspective. Ambition doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for ideal conditions. It moves when it feels momentum. So the mistake is not ambition. The mistake is misunderstanding the battlefield. This isn't a neutral space. It's not a level platform. It's not a fair psychological environment. It's a space dominated by narrative weight. People don't just see Chuck Norris as a person. They see him as a symbol. Symbols operate differently. You don't beat symbols easily. You disrupt them slowly, over time, through consistency and repetition, not through single moments. That's where challengers often miscalculate. They treat symbolic opponents like normal opponents. They treat reputational power like physical power. They treat narrative dominance like skill dominance. But those things require different strategies. A legend doesn't need to overwhelm you. They just need to let the structure work in their favor. And this is where the situation becomes uncomfortable to accept. Sometimes the environment itself decides the outcome more than the individuals involved. Not because of fate, not because of destiny, but because systems reward stability and punish disruption. Established figures benefit from inertia. Challengers fight against inertia. This doesn't make the challenger wrong. It makes the task heavier. So when people say big mistake, they often mean it emotionally. But analytically, the mistake is structural. It's stepping into a space where the rules are already written by perception, expectation, and narrative momentum. This is not a moral failure. It's not stupidity. It's not weakness. It's misalignment. Misalignment between ambition and environment. Misalignment between confidence and structure. Misalignment between desire and reality. And that's something almost everyone experiences in some form. Not just in confrontations, but in careers, competition, and life decisions. Sometimes you don't lose because you're incapable. You lose because the space you entered wasn't designed for your success. That's the uncomfortable truth people avoid, because it challenges the simple idea that effort always equals outcome. It doesn't. Context matters. Structure matters. Narrative power matters. Psychological positioning matters. And ignoring those layers is often where real mistakes begin. Not an action, but an interpretation. Up to this point, the situation may seem heavily tilted in favor of Chuck Norris, as if Jason is walking into a challenge that is almost designed for him to lose. But to understand this fully, it's important to shift perspective and examine the scenario from Jason's side. From the outside, Jason's decision can look reckless. From the inside, it may feel necessary. For someone trying to rise, safe moves rarely change status. Incremental progress doesn't always earn attention. In many competitive environments, the only way to break through noise is to take a risk that feels unreasonable to others. From Jason's viewpoint, challenging a legend might not be about arrogance. It might be about survival and relevance. If he challenges someone ordinary, the victory may be ignored. If he challenges a legend, even the attempt creates visibility. In that sense, the challenge becomes strategic in a different way, not about guaranteed success, but about maximizing impact. This reframes the story. Instead of asking, why would he do this? We can ask, what choice did he have if he wanted real recognition? There's also a psychological layer here that favors the challenger in some ways. Jason has less to lose in terms of legacy. His reputation is still being built. That freedom can allow boldness, experimentation, and emotional intensity. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, carries the weight of expectation. While his status gives him narrative advantage, it also limits flexibility. A legend is expected to act a certain way, perform a certain way, and maintain a specific image. That can create its own form of pressure, not to rise, but to avoid falling. So the power dynamic isn't completely one-sided. Jason can afford risk. Chuck Norris must avoid embarrassment. That creates a subtle reversal. A challenger can sometimes play with unpredictability. They can break patterns, disrupt pacing, and force the established figure into uncomfortable territory. Even if the odds are against them, they have the potential to shift the tone of the confrontation simply by refusing to play by expected rules. Another important point, people often confuse probability with impossibility. Yes, Jason's challenge is unlikely to succeed under normal expectations. But unlikely does not mean impossible. History, in sports, business, and culture, is filled with moments where outsiders defied dominant narratives. Not because they were favored, but because they exploited timing, surprise, and momentum. From this angle, Jason's move stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like a gamble. A gamble with high risk. A gamble with low probability. But also a gamble with high reward. Even if he fails, he may gain respect for trying. Even if he loses, he may gain visibility. Even if he falls short, he may shift how he is perceived. So the midpoint realization is this. The challenge is not only about winning. It's also about positioning, signaling ambition, and refusing to stay invisible. Is it better to play safe and stay unnoticed, or take a risky challenge that could change how people see you? This perspective doesn't cancel out the earlier analysis. It adds balance. Chuck Norris still holds narrative power. Jason still faces structural disadvantage. But now the story becomes more nuanced, not just about a likely outcome, but about why someone would willingly step into a situation that seems stacked against them. This shift matters because it turns the story from a foolish mistake into a calculated risk under pressure. And that difference changes how we interpret everything that follows. The real mistake is not challenging Chuck Norris. It is misunderstanding what kind of opponent he represents. Most challengers prepare as if they are facing a normal rival, someone with strengths, weaknesses, patterns, and limits that can be tested directly. But Chuck Norris, in this scenario, does not function like a typical opponent. He operates more like a symbolic figure, a person whose power comes not only from ability, but from narrative, reputation, and expectation. Jason approaches the challenge as if it's a standard test of capability. He treats it like a measurable contest, something that can be solved with effort, intensity, and confidence. But that mindset overlooks an important reality. Chuck Norris is framed as someone who represents inevitability rather than competition. A normal opponent can be pressured, rushed, or overwhelmed. A symbolic opponent thrives on pressure directed toward them. Chuck Norris benefits from public belief in his dominance. That belief shapes how every exchange is interpreted. If he stays calm, it looks like control. If he waits, it looks like intelligence. If he strikes rarely, it looks like precision. Jason, meanwhile, is forced to fight against more than just a person. He must fight against the audience's expectations, the myths surrounding his opponent, and the assumption that he is stepping into unwinnable territory. That creates a layered challenge. Jason might believe the key is effort, pushing harder, moving faster, showing more aggression. But symbolic opponents are often strengthened by exactly that kind of behavior. The more Jason tries to force momentum, the more he feeds into the idea that he is struggling to catch something untouchable. This transforms the nature of the confrontation. Instead of being about dominance, it becomes about control of perception. Instead of being about physical exchanges, it becomes about who looks composed. Instead of being about who acts more, it becomes about who appears more inevitable. If Jason does not recognize this shift, he risks playing the wrong game entirely. The challenge is no longer how do I outperform him? It becomes how do I disrupt the image surrounding him? That requires a different strategy, one based on restraint, timing, unpredictability, and psychological disruption rather than raw pressure. Visually, this dynamic would show through contrast and presence. Jason may appear active, intense, and urgent, signaling effort. Chuck Norris may appear minimal, still, and deliberate, signaling authority. The camera framing, crowd reaction, and pacing would naturally reinforce the idea that one side is chasing, while the other is defining the tempo. I want to approach this topic in a thoughtful and grounded way, because it's easy to fall into hype, exaggeration, or fan-driven storytelling when talking about a name like Chuck Norris. Instead of treating this as a fantasy battle or a power-scaling debate, this analysis treats the situation as a symbolic and psychological case study. This means we're not asking, who would win in a real fight? We're asking, why does this challenge feel like a mistake before it even happens? That difference matters. Some of what I'm going to say is based on cultural perception, media portrayal, and the myth built around legendary figures, not on literal reality. Chuck Norris here represents an idea more than just a person. Jason, on the other hand, represents a challenger, someone driven by ambition, hunger, pride, or the need to prove themselves. So when Jason challenges Chuck Norris, the story stops being about strength alone. It becomes about timing, expectations, pressure, narrative, and psychology. I'm also assuming that viewers already bring their own biases into this scenario. Many people already see Chuck Norris as unbeatable, not because of real-world evidence, but because of years of jokes, movies, stories, and cultural reinforcement. That perception shapes how any challenge against him is interpreted. That's important to admit up front, because if we ignore perception, we miss the real point of the story. Another thing to clarify, this isn't meant to insult Jason or paint him as foolish. Challenging a legend can come from many motivations: ambition, desperation, courage, or even strategic thinking. In some cases, aiming for the biggest name is the only way to get noticed at all. So instead of labeling the challenger as arrogant, the better question is whether the context of the challenge makes success realistically possible. I'm also aware that this type of topic can easily turn into hero worship or character glorification. That's not the goal here. The goal is to analyze why some figures become psychologically untouchable and why stepping into that space often puts the challenger at an immediate disadvantage, even before skill is considered. If this sounds analytical, that's intentional. This framing treats the confrontation like a thought experiment. What happens when confidence meets cultural myth? What happens when ambition meets a reputation that already feels unbeatable? What happens when the public already expects one side to win? Those expectations matter more than people often realize. In many competitive situations, whether in sports, entertainment, or real life, perception can influence outcomes as strongly as preparation. When the audience, the media, and even the challenger themselves already believe one side has the upper hand, that belief can affect decision-making, performance, and judgment in subtle but powerful ways. So, throughout this video, I'm not presenting final answers. I'm walking through reasoning, showing how assumptions form, how narratives build pressure, and how certain choices begin to look risky once we consider the psychological and symbolic layers around them. You don't have to fully agree with this perspective. In fact, disagreement can make the discussion more interesting. The goal is not to declare who is right, but to explore why this challenge feels like a big mistake to many observers before anything even happens. Question: do you think overanalyzing a challenge makes it clearer? Or does it sometimes distract from the simple reality of competition?